All right, good morning, class. This is going to be day 2 of the domain and range. Last time in our last video, we did examples 1 through 4. In this one, we're going to go over examples 5 through 8. But before we look at the examples, just to talk about some of the terms that we're going to be using. Maybe you remember them from Algebra 1, or maybe even geometry at some point. But we're going to be talking about domain and range. Okay, domain is considering all the x values that make up the function or the graph, and range are all the y values that make up the function or the graph. Okay, to determine which of the values of x are in the domain of the function, we look at the graph from left to right. So we would actually look at the domain from left to right, so that it's going to put a left arrow, right arrow. For range, we look from bottom to top, so from the bottom to the top, so up and down, right? Left and right for domain, up and down for range. Another thing I want to talk about is the notation that we're going to use when we talk about an interval. An interval is a set of numbers that you're saying, from beginning to end. Where does the graph begin? Where does it end? And it could have points that break up because there's gaps or discontinuous parts, like we talked about in the last video. So in textbooks, sometimes they write domain and range in set builder notation or interval notation, or both. But in this class, we'll specifically work with interval notation. So some of you may be familiar with interval notation. But basically, interval notation, we use brackets and parentheses. And if you remember, brackets correspond to closed points on the graph or closed circles. Or you could also be talking about solid lines in the graph or the function. Parentheses, we use open circles or open dots, or if we're talking about an asymptote, we might use a dashed line. And then when we use parentheses, we also think of when we're defining something that goes to infinity in both directions, right? Negative and positive. So we're talking about negative infinity and positive infinity. Those are our end locations and starting locations, whatever they may be. We're going to use parentheses next to them. All right, so let's go ahead and jump to the first example. And again, remember, this is example 5 because last video we did 1 through 4. So always make sure to read the instructions, right? Every problem, whether it's on a quiz or a test, it's important to read the instructions just so that we know what we're doing, right? What is the problem asking us for? So in this case, it's asking us to write the domain and range for each continuous function using interval notation. So remember, we talked about continuous functions in the last video, and those are functions that you can draw or write out with your pen or your pencil without lifting your pen or pencil from the paper, right? I think that's how we defined it last time. Okay, so this example 5, I broke it up. It's the same graph, same function, right? It's just a copy. But on the left side here, we're going to be discussing domain, and on the right side, we're going to be discussing range. Okay, so last year, I had students, I gave them all, those little dry spaghettis that you can find at the store, and you would kind of use those to kind of roll across your paper. I mean, if you have some at home, you can use some of that, or if you just have a pencil that's nice and smooth to roll over, you can do that as well. But in this app that I'm using, I'm going to go ahead and draw a vertical line. Let me see if how thick it's going to come out. All right, so that's pretty good. I'm going to color code. So domain is going to be green, range is going to be purple. And let me make sure this line is straight. Okay. And so this is like what I did last year. I had students, use a spaghetti stick, and they would kind of roll this across the page. Let me actually make this a little bit longer here. And so for domain, we're scanning from left to right, and we said for range, we're going from bottom to top, right? But we have to look at it like so. Okay, so for range, we're going from bottom to top. For domain, we're going from left to right. So just to keep that in mind, right? Okay, so let's look at domain. As I'm scanning from left to right, let's start at the very far left. Where's the first point, the first value that I make contact with the graph, right? It's at -4. There's a solid closed dot there. So we would say that the domain, it's a closed circle, and we put the first value, -4. That's the first value that we make contact with the graph. And then as I'm scanning through, right, you notice that this green line is making contact with the blue line, right, with the function. But what happens, this far right corner where the graph kind of ends, right, it ends at what value? It looks like +8, right? But is it a closed circle or open circle? So I'm going to put comma, the value where it ended, and it's an open circle, so I'm going to use parentheses. Okay. So this is, going from left to right. It goes left all the way to -4. That's the starting point. And then as I'm scanning to the right, the last number that I make contact with is -8, but it's an open circle, so I put a parentheses. You don't have to write left and right? We just have to write the values. I'm just doing this for the first example. Okay, now let's look at range. Range, we're going to be scanning from bottom to top. So as I'm approaching the graph from the bottom, I make contact at this value here. It's at -7. Comma. And then where do I go? I'm scanning. And the last point that I make contact with the graph is at y = 2. At 2. Now, the question is, should I put parentheses or brackets, right? For -7, there was an open circle there, so I'm going to put parentheses. As I scanned and I got to +2, there's a closed circle at +2, so I'm going to put a bracket. And we're going, you usually put the lowest number first, and then the highest number, because we're scanning from bottom to top. So the first number you want to put is the value at the very bottom, and then the second number is going to be the value on top. So the first number is on the bottom, the second number is on top. For domain, we just want to know what's the farthest left that will go and the farthest right. And you don't have to write left and right or bottom and top. I'm just doing that for the first example. Okay. So quick review, right? For domain, we're scanning from left to right. For range, we're scanning from bottom to top. Okay. Oh, let me go ahead and delete these. All right, let's go to the next example. Okay, so just a reminder again, we are using the same graph, and I just did the same graph twice. But again, on one side we're looking at domain, and the other side we're looking at range. And so for domain, I'm going to draw a vertical line, and then for range, I'm going to draw a horizontal line. Okay, so for domain, again, we're scanning from left to right, scanning from left to right. So as I'm scanning, as I'm approaching this blue graph, oh, I make contact at -1. Is that location, does it have a closed circle or open circle? It's closed, so I'm going to put a bracket, comma. Okay, so let's keep going. Just keep scanning. I'm still making contact with the graph, still making contact. But what does this arrow mean? Does that mean that the graph ends there? Or does it keep going? Right? And the answer is, from geometry, if it has an arrow, it keeps going. Where does it go to? It's going to go infinitely to the right. Because even if I stopped drawing right here, this arrow means it's going to keep going and going and going. So it's going to go to the right all the way towards infinity. If you go back to the beginning of the video, what notation do I use for infinity? Parentheses, right? Okay, now let's look at range. Range is scanning from bottom to the top. Bottom to top. So as I'm approaching the graph from the bottom, I make contact. And at what value do I make contact on the y-axis? At -2. Is that an open circle or a closed circle? It's closed, so I'm going to put a bracket, comma, and as I keep going up, I keep making contact with the graph, and I have this arrow again, so that means it's going to go towards infinity. Oh, sorry about that. It's going to go towards infinity. So, infinity with a parentheses, remember that. So, again, I'm scanning and I start from the bottom and I hit -2 and I keep scanning, and the graph goes towards infinity. So, again, the domain and range is only interested in where the graph exists, right? So as I was scanning the domain, did the graph exist at -4? No. Did it exist at -3? -2? No. It started at -1. So that's where my domain starts. Let's take a look at the range. Did my graph exist at -4? No. -3? No. -2, it started, right? That was our starting point. And then as I kept going up, it went towards infinity. So these intervals are only interested in where the graph exists. Okay. So let me go ahead and delete these. All right, so let's go to example number 7. And I'm going to use, again, green for domain and purple for range. For domain, I'm using a vertical line, and for range, I'm using, purple. I'm using a horizontal line. And I like to make sure the lines are as straight as possible. Alright, so we're going to scan from left to right. So again, I have this arrow situation. What does the arrow mean? That it's going to go, that the graph exists to the left, right? Even though I didn't, the blue part kind of ends right here. The arrow means that it keeps going. We stop because the page stops, right? But the arrow keeps going, so it's going towards negative infinity. So it actually exists at negative infinity. We put parentheses for infinities, comma, where does the graph end if I'm scanning from left to right? As I get to the right side, the graph keeps going because of the arrow. So that means that it's positive infinity. Now let's look at the range. If I'm scanning from bottom to top, I'm scanning all the y values. Where does the graph start? Does it exist at -5, -6? No, right? It starts at -4. It starts at -4. Now, should I put a parentheses or a bracket in front of -4? Well, at -4, is the graph closed or open? Right? Is it a solid line or a dashed line? It looks like a solid line. So we would say it's closed. So we can put a bracket there. Comma. What is the highest value that we reach? Well, the graph starts at -4 on the y, and it keeps going and going, and the arrows mean it's going to go towards infinity. Towards infinity, with parentheses on the infinity. Okay? So there you have it. You have domain and range for this function. Let me go ahead and delete these vertical and horizontal lines. And let's move over to the last example. Example number 8. I don't know why these moved along. Go ahead and erase them. Okay. Last example. Again, I'm going to color code. So vertical line here. And a horizontal line here. Right. Last example for today. So domain is scanning from left to right. Okay. So as I start on my left side, I see an arrow. So the arrow tells me that I'm going to be starting at negative infinity, because it goes towards negative infinity. There's an arrow there. And then keep scanning, and I keep hitting the graph. But what happens is I get to the right part, right? The rightmost part of the graph. There's this boundary, okay? And remember, we talked about it, I think, in the last video. This is called a asymptote. And it's over here as well. And just to define it again, right? It's usually an imaginary boundary. You don't really see it on the graph. You don't really see it, if you graph it on a calculator or some sort of program. But it's an imaginary boundary that tells you where the graph cannot pass. Okay, so that means that this graph cannot pass what value? Can't pass the value of x equals 3. So that's where my graph ends. So I'm going to put comma 3. But should I put a bracket or parentheses after 3? Should I put a bracket or parentheses? And since it's an asymptote, it's a boundary that this blue graph will never touch. This blue graph will never touch this red boundary. So if it's never going to touch, then there's always constantly that there's going to be an opening there. So it's an open location. So what notation do we use if it's open? Parentheses. Okay. If it was closed, I would have put bracket. But it's going to remain open because the blue graph will never reach that boundary. It'll never make contact, so it'll never touch x equals 3. All right, let's look at range now. Let's look at range. So as we're scanning, am I still making contact with the graph, with the blue line? Yeah, do you guys see that? This point is still making contact. If I move the vertical line up, yeah, I'm still making contact, but this time over here. So where do I start making contact with the graph? Well, this arrow, there's an arrow here. So that arrow means that the blue graph is going to go towards infinity. But positive or negative, right? Negative infinity, right? Because these y values are going to go to negative infinity. These x values go to negative. These y values go to positive, positive. But since we're going scanning from bottom to top, this graph goes as low as negative infinity. And before I forget, right, for infinities we put parentheses, comma, let's see, where does this graph end? As I'm scanning from towards the top, what does the arrow mean again? Because there's an arrow here. It means that the graph keeps going, right? So even though I didn't draw it, it's going to keep going up and up towards positive infinity. Okay, so let me go ahead and summarize this one again. So let's reset. So for domain, I'm scanning from left to right. As I'm scanning from the left, there's an arrow, so that means negative infinity. Check. Then I'm scanning from moving this green line. I'm still hitting the graph, but then this boundary doesn't allow the graph to cross, right? What value does this boundary exist on? This boundary exists on 3, so that's my ending point, ending location. But why did we put parentheses instead of bracket? Because we said that the blue line will never touch the red line, so it'll never make contact with x equals 3. Okay. And let's summarize the range again. So the range makes contact at negative infinity. Why did we determine that it's at negative infinity? Because the graph has an arrow, like a blue arrow here. That means that the graph keeps going towards infinity, downward, right, towards infinity. And I'm scanning, and I reach the topmost part, but there's an arrow there. So that means that the graph keeps going towards positive infinity on the y. Okay. All right, so that brings us to the end of the lesson today. Again, feel free to rewind or go back as needed, but the main concept for today is knowing the difference between domain and range. Right? Domain is going from left to right is scanning the graph from left to right, and we're checking all the x values where the graph exists. And range is scanning from bottom to top, and it's scanning for all the y values where the graph exists. Okay, thank you for joining me today, and I'll see you next time in class, and I'll be able to answer any details or any questions that you didn't get answered on this video. So I'll see you next time. Have a great day, and thank you for joining me.